He raised his champagne glass, smiled at the room, and said, "Some people should know their place, even on a day like this." I remember the way the chandelier light caught the crystal, scattering it across the white tablecloth like tiny fractures, and for a second, I thought I had misheard him, that maybe at 72, after 33 years of working double shifts and raising a daughter on my own, my ears had finally started to fail me, but then I heard the soft laughter, polite, controlled, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor but from agreement, and I knew exactly what he meant and exactly who he was talking about. I stood there with my hands folded in front of me, the same hands that had spent decades chopping vegetables at 5 in the morning, scrubbing floors long after everyone else had gone home, the same hands that had held my daughter when she was too small to understand why her father wasn't coming back. And I said nothing, I didn't move, I didn't defend myself, I didn't look away. I just stood there and let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable, until it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. My daughter was seated just a few feet away in a white chair with a woven back, her dress spilling over the sides like something out of a magazine, and when I looked at her, really looked at her, she didn't meet my eyes. She adjusted the napkin on her lap, glanced down at her ring, and then turned slightly toward her new family as if she belonged more to them now than she ever had to me, and that was the moment I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. For a very long time, it wasn't just him who thought I didn't belong. It was easier for her to let him say it than to stop him. I could still hear the faint clink of silverware, the low murmur of guests shifting in their seats. Someone coughed quietly near the back of the room, and he continued, as if what he'd said was nothing more than a harmless observation. "We all come from different backgrounds," he added, taking a slow sip from his glass, his eyes never leaving mine, "but some of us have learned how to rise above them," and again, that same soft laughter, that same subtle nodding, the kind that passes between people who have already decided who is acceptable and who is not. I felt the edge of the table beneath my fingertips, cool and smooth, grounding me in a way I didn't expect, and I pressed my hand against it for just a second before pulling it back, because I refused to let them see even the smallest sign that I had been shaken. I had spent too many years building myself quietly, carefully, piece by piece, to let a man who had known me for less than a year define me in a single sentence. I looked around that room, at the polished shoes, the pressed suits, the carefully arranged centerpieces, and I realized something else, something that settled deep in my chest like a quiet certainty. They all thought they understood me, they thought they had already measured my worth and found it lacking, and the truth was, I had let them believe that. I had let my daughter believe it too, because sometimes it is easier to stay silent than to explain a lifetime to people who have already made up their minds. I picked up my glass, not to drink, but to steady my hands, and I held it there for a moment, watching the light pass through it, and I thought about everything that had led me to that room, every early morning, every late night, every sacrifice that had never been seen, and I said nothing, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I knew that whatever I chose to do next, it would not happen. In that moment, not in front of 200 people who had already decided who I was, I let him have his speech, I let them have their laughter, and I stood there, quiet and still, because I had learned a long time ago that silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is preparation. And as I stood there in that room, with my daughter looking everywhere but at me and a man raising his glass as if he had just proven something, I made a decision I would not share with anyone that night, not yet. I would wait. I stayed through the rest of the reception, not because I wanted to, but because leaving would have made it easier. For them to believe their version of me, the quiet woman who could be dismissed with a sentence. So I sat at that table, back straight, hands folded neatly in my lap, and I watched everything. I watched who leaned in to speak to him, who laughed a little too quickly, who avoided me entirely as if silence could make them invisible to their own behavior, and every now and then someone would offer me a thin smile, the kind that does not reach the eyes, and say something like, "Beautiful ceremony, isn't it?" As if we were all participating in the same reality, and I would nod and answer politely because I have always known how to behave in rooms that were not built for me. My daughter came by once, just once, her heels soft against the floor as she approached, her voice low, careful. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked without quite looking at me, and I studied her face, the way she held herself now, composed, practiced, and I said, "I am fine," because I was not going to give her something she did not know how to carry. She hesitated, just for a second, then glanced over her shoulder toward his family, and I could see it, the pull, the quiet calculation, and she said, "He did not mean it like that," and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because I had heard that sentence in so many different forms over the years, people explaining away what should never have been said in the first place, and I replied, "He meant exactly what he said," and that was the end of it. She nodded, relieved perhaps that I was not going to make a scene, and she went back to them, and I sat there a little longer, long enough to understand that nothing else of value was going to happen in that room for me. When I finally stood up, no one stopped me, no one asked where I was going, and that told me more than anything else could have. The parking lot was quiet, lined with cars that cost more than the first place I ever lived. And I walked to my car at the far end, the same car I had been driving for years, the engine turning over with a familiar sound that felt more honest than anything I had heard inside. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, not crying, not shaking, just breathing, letting the noise of the evening settle into something I could examine, and then I drove home, the roads mostly empty, the streetlights passing in steady intervals, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew what I was going to do next. Inside, my house was exactly as I had left it, quiet, orderly, every object in its place. I set my keys on the table, took off my shoes, and walked down the hallway to the small room I rarely showed anyone. At the back, behind a plain wooden door, there was a cabinet built into the wall, reinforced, secured, not because I had anything to hide, but because some things in life deserve to be protected properly. I opened it, slowly, and reached for a file I had not touched in months, maybe longer. The paper was thick, official, the kind that carries weight even before you read a single word, and as I held it in my hands, I could hear his voice again, clear as if he were standing right in front of me. "Some people should know their place," he had said, and I let that sentence sit there, just for a moment, not with anger, but with clarity, because I had spent a lifetime being underestimated, and I had learned something very important from that. When people think you have nothing, they stop paying attention, they stop asking questions, they stop looking closely, and that is when you have the most room to move. I placed the document on the table, smoothed it flat with the palm of my hand, and I said out loud, though there was no one there to hear it, "All right," not as a reaction, but as a decision, because whatever happened next was not going to be rushed, not going to be loud, and not going to be careless. I would take my time, I would understand exactly what I was dealing with, and then, when the moment was right, I would respond in a way they would not be able to ignore. I did not sleep that night, not because I was upset, but because my mind had already moved past what had been said and was focused entirely On what it meant, I sat at my kitchen table with a single lamp on, the same table where I had paid bills for decades, where I had stretched every dollar until it could stretch no further, and I opened the file in front of me, turning each page slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it again, every document, every signature, every date. All of it tied together in a way that most people would never think to question. I ran my finger along one line in particular, a name I had heard earlier that evening, spoken casually, almost proudly, as if it carried a kind of authority, and I let out a quiet breath. "So that is where you are," I said softly, because now I understood the connection, not fully yet, but enough to know that what had happened in that room was not just arrogance, it was assumption built on incomplete information. And that kind of mistake tends to be expensive. The next morning I made coffee the same way I always do, measured, precise, 2 spoons of grounds, water just under boiling, nothing rushed, nothing careless. And by the time the sun came through the window, I had already made 2 decisions. The first was that I would not call my daughter, not yet, because whatever she chose to believe about me, she would have to sit with it a little longer. And the second was that I would start asking questions, not directly, not in a way that would draw attention, but quietly, the way I have always done things. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not used in some time. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Good morning, this is Robert," he said, steady, professional, and I allowed myself a small pause before speaking. "Robert, it is Laura." There was a shift on the other end, not surprise, but recognition. "Laura, it has been a while," he replied, and I could hear the respect in his tone. The kind that comes from years of careful work and consistency. "I need to review something," I said, keeping my voice even, and I need it handled quietly. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He never had. "Of course," he said. "When would you like to come in?" I glanced at the papers in front of me, then at the clock on the wall. "This afternoon," I answered, and that was enough. When I hung up, I gathered the documents and placed them back into their folder, smoothing the edges, aligning them perfectly, because details matter, especially when other people have stopped paying attention to them. The drive to his office took just under 30 minutes, a familiar route I had taken many times before, though not recently. And as I walked into the building, no one looked at me twice, just another older woman in sensible shoes, carrying a plain folder, and that is exactly how I prefer it. Robert met me in his office, stood when I entered, and gestured toward the chair across from him. "What are we looking at?" he asked, and I placed the folder on his desk, opening it carefully, turning it so he could see. His eyes moved across the page, then back again, slower this time, more focused, and I watched his expression change, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind that tells you something has shifted. "Do you recognize the name?" I asked, and he leaned back in his chair, considering it for a moment before nodding once. "I do," he said. "They have been expanding recently, aggressively." I folded my hands in my lap, calm, patient. "And their position?" I asked. "Is it as stable as they present it to be?" He hesitated, just briefly, then answered carefully. "On the surface, yes," he said, "but there are dependencies." I let that word sit between us. "Dependencies on what?" I asked, and he looked down at the document again, then back at me. "On assets they do not fully control," he said quietly, and I felt something settle into place, not satisfaction, not yet, but confirmation. "I see," I replied, and I closed the folder, resting my hand on top of it. "Then I would like to understand exactly how much control they think they have," I said, my voice steady, because this was no longer about what had been said at a wedding. This was about structure, leverage, and truth, and those are things I understand very well. Robert gave a small nod, already reaching for his pen. "I will start pulling everything together," he said, and I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. Take your time, I told him, because I meant it. I had waited 33 years to build what I had. I could wait a little longer to use it properly. By the time I stepped out of Robert's office, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, like something that had been blurred for a long time was finally starting to come into focus. I did not rush to my car. I never rush after making a decision that matters. Instead, I walked slowly down the sidewalk, past people who were moving quickly, talking into their phones, carrying their urgency like it meant something permanent. And I thought about how many times in my life I had been underestimated simply because I did not move like that, because I did not announce what I was doing before I understood it fully. And I realized again that most people confuse noise with power. That afternoon I stopped at a small grocery store on my way home, the same one I had been going to for years. I picked up a few things I did not really need: milk, bread, a small container of soup. Because routine matters. It keeps everything else steady. And when I reached the register, the young cashier smiled at me. "How is your day going?" she asked, and I answered, "It is going exactly the way it should," because that was the truth, even if she did not understand it. When I got home, I placed everything in its proper place, set the receipt neatly on the counter, and then I sat down again at the table, not to review the documents this time, but to think, not about what had happened, but about what had led to it, because nothing like that ever appears out of nowhere. It builds quietly, over time, and I could see it now, clearer than I had before. The first time I met his family, the way his father had shaken my hand just a little too briefly, his smile polite but measured, as if he had already decided how much of himself I was worth, the way his mother had asked me what I did, not out of curiosity, but out of assessment, and when I told her I had worked in food service for most of my life, she had nodded slowly and said, "That must have been challenging," in a tone that suggested she meant something else entirely. I remembered the dinners where conversations would shift when I spoke, the subtle redirection, the topics that did not quite include me, and I remembered my daughter watching all of it, absorbing it, adjusting herself to fit into that world more comfortably. And I had told myself at the time that it was natural, that she was building a life, that she would find her balance, but sitting there now, I understood that balance had never really been the goal. Acceptance had been, and acceptance often comes with a cost. I reached for my phone, not to call her, but to open a message she had sent me a few weeks earlier, a simple text. "We are having dinner with his parents on Sunday. I will call you after." She had never called, and I had not asked why, because I have always believed that if someone wants to speak to you, they will, and if they do not, asking does not change that. I set the phone back down and leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room, and then, almost as if it had been waiting for the right moment, another detail came to me, something small from the reception, the way his father had mentioned a property during his speech, casually, as if it were a point of pride. The name had sounded familiar even then, but I had not placed it immediately, and now, after what Robert had said, it settled into place. I stood up and walked back to the cabinet, opened it again, and pulled out a second folder, thinner, older, the edges slightly worn from time. I flipped through it until I found the page I was looking for, the address, the acquisition date, the ownership structure, all of it laid out in clean, precise lines, and I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest, not excitement, not anger, just certainty. "You should have been more careful," I said softly, not as a threat, but as an observation, because the truth is, people who believe they are untouchable often stop checking the details. They assume the ground beneath them will always hold, and they forget that sometimes, that ground belongs to someone else. I closed the folder and placed it beside the first, aligning them perfectly, and for the first time since the reception, I allowed myself the smallest hint of something else, not satisfaction, not yet, but direction, because now I knew where to look, and more importantly, I knew exactly how patient I needed to be. I did not reach out to anyone for the next few days, not my daughter, not anyone from that evening, because silence, when used correctly, does more than any explanation ever could. It gives you space to observe what people do when they believe you are no longer paying attention, and that is when the truth begins to show itself. Robert called me 3 days later, late in the afternoon. His voice calm but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Laura, I have something you should see," he said, and I could hear papers shifting on his desk, the quiet rhythm of someone who had been working carefully through details that most people would overlook. "Is it what we expected?" I asked, already knowing the answer by the tone of his voice. There was a brief pause. "It is more than that," he replied, and I nodded. Even though he could not see me. "I will come in," I said, and I was already reaching for my coat. When I arrived, he did not waste time with small talk. He closed the door behind me and placed a file on the desk, thicker than before, marked with tabs, annotations, small notes that told me he had gone deeper than a surface review. I sat down and opened it, turning the first page, then the next, my eyes moving steadily, not rushing, not reacting, just taking it in. Numbers, ownership structures, layered entities, and there it was again, the same name, repeated, but now surrounded by context. Connections, dependencies, they have been leveraging properties they do not fully own, Robert said quietly, and in several cases, those properties trace back to holding structures that connect here. He tapped lightly on the page in front of me, and I followed his finger, reading the line twice, just to be certain, before leaning back slightly in my chair. "And they believe this is stable," I said, not as a question, but as a statement. He gave a small, careful nod. "They believe no one is looking closely," he answered, and I allowed a faint exhale, not surprise, not disbelief, just confirmation. "They were not expecting anyone like me to look," I said, and there was no arrogance in it, only fact, because people like him, men who speak confidently in rooms full of people who agree with them, often forget that the quiet ones have the most time to notice patterns. I turned another page and saw something that made me stop, not visibly, but enough that my hand rested on the paper a moment longer. A specific property, the same one he had mentioned in his speech, positioned in a way that made it appear central to their expansion, but the underlying structure told a different story, one that depended on a chain of agreements that could shift if even one piece moved. I looked up at Robert. "If that agreement changes," I said slowly, "what happens?" He did not answer immediately, which told me the answer mattered. "Their position weakens significantly," he said, choosing his words with care. "In some cases, it could collapse the entire arrangement." I nodded once, closing the file gently, my hand resting on top of it, steady, controlled, because this was the moment where most people would feel something sharp. Anger, satisfaction, the urge to act quickly, but I felt none of that, only clarity. "Then we will not rush," I said, and he studied me for a second, as if confirming that I meant it. "No," I continued, "we will understand every piece first." I stood up, smoothing the sleeve of my jacket, and added, "I want a full map of every connection, every dependency, and every point where control can shift." He nodded, already reaching for his pen again. "I will have it prepared," he said, and as I turned to leave, I paused at the door, just long enough to say, "And Robert?" He looked up. "Keep this quiet," I said, and there was no need to explain why. He simply nodded, understanding. When I stepped back outside The sky had already started to darken, the air cooler now, steady, and I walked to my car with the same measured pace, because nothing about what I was doing required urgency, only precision, and as I drove home, I thought again about that room, about the laughter, about the certainty in his voice when he decided who I was, and I realized something that settled deeper than anything else so far. He had not just underestimated me, he had built his confidence on that mistake, and that kind of confidence is the easiest to take apart, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with timing, and I rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, my eyes steady on the road ahead, because I knew now that everything I needed was already in place. I just had to decide when to use it. The next week passed without a single word from them, and that told me more than any conversation could have, because when people believe they have secured their place above you, they stop checking whether you are still standing, they assume you will remain exactly where they left you, quiet, unchanged, and that assumption is where they become careless. I kept my routine the same. I woke up early, made my coffee, read through the notes Robert had begun compiling, each page more detailed than the last, connections mapped out with precision, timelines aligned, ownership layers peeled back one by one until what looked solid on the surface began to show its fractures underneath. And I noticed something else, something smaller, but just as important, a pattern in how decisions had been made, quick expansions, aggressive positioning, choices that relied heavily on appearances holding long enough for the next step to be secured. And I said quietly to myself, you built this fast, because speed can create the illusion of strength, but it rarely replaces stability. 2 days later, my phone rang in the late afternoon. The name on the screen was my daughter's, and for a moment I let it ring once more before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of control. Hello, I said, my voice even, and there was a brief pause on the other end, as if she had expected something different, something softer. Mom, she said, her tone careful. I wanted to check in, and I could hear the distance in her voice, the same distance that had been growing for years. I am fine, I replied, because I was, and I let the silence stretch just enough for her to decide what to say next. About the other night, she began, then stopped, choosing her words. Things were a little tense. I almost smiled at that, the way discomfort is often reduced to something smaller to make it easier to handle. Your father-in-law was speaking his mind, I said calmly, not giving her an easier version of it, and she exhaled softly. He did not mean to offend you, she said again, and I closed my eyes for just a second, not in frustration, but in recognition. You have said that before, I answered, and there was another pause, longer this time. He comes from a different world, she added, as if that explained something, and I replied, so do I, and I let that sit there, because it was true, just not in the way she understood. She shifted the conversation slightly after that, asking about small things, how I had been, whether I needed anything. Questions that sounded like care but felt like obligation, and I answered each one simply, without adding anything more than what was necessary, because I was listening to what she was not saying. She did not ask if I had been hurt, she did not ask how I felt, and that told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. Before ending the call, she hesitated again. We are having dinner with his parents this weekend, she said. They would like you to come, and there it was, not an apology, not an acknowledgement, but an invitation, as if proximity could smooth over what had already been made clear. I considered it for a moment, not emotionally, but strategically, because timing matters more than reaction. I will think about it, I said, and she seemed relieved by that. Okay, she replied quickly, just let me know. And when the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and sat there for a moment, looking at it, not with disappointment, but with clarity. Because now I understood the shape of things, the expectations, the assumptions, the quiet Belief that everything could continue as it had before, I reached for the folder beside me, opened it, and reviewed one particular page again, the one that outlined the key dependency Robert had identified. The point where control could shift if the right move was made, and I traced the line with my finger, slowly, deliberately, because this was not about proving anything in a room full of people, this was about showing the truth in a way that could not be dismissed. I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, "Not yet," because I knew that whatever I chose to do next, it would not happen at their table, not under their terms. It would happen when everything was fully understood, when every piece was in place, and when the moment carried the weight it needed to be seen clearly. I closed the folder and set it aside, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because patience is not about waiting without purpose, it is about preparing without being noticed, and I had no intention of being noticed until it mattered. 2 days before that dinner, Robert called again, earlier than I expected, and that alone told me something had shifted. "Laura," he said, his voice quieter this time, more deliberate, "we need to go over one more piece." I did not ask what it was, I simply said, "I will be there in 20 minutes, because when details begin to move faster than planned, it is never by accident. It is because something underneath has been disturbed." When I arrived, he did not sit behind his desk this time, he stood by the window with a folder already open, as if he had been waiting for me to walk in before continuing. "I went deeper into the ownership chain," he said, turning slightly so I could see the documents laid out across the table, and I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the pages, familiar names, familiar structures, but now arranged differently, revealing something that had not been visible before. "They have been repositioning assets quietly," he continued, "moving them through short-term agreements to create the appearance of control." I nodded once, following the pattern, because it was not new to me, just more layered than I had initially seen. "And the property he mentioned," I said, my voice steady, "where does it sit now?" Robert did not answer immediately. Instead he turned one page, then another, until he reached the document he wanted me to see, and when I read it, I understood why he had called me in. The structure had changed, not dramatically, but enough to matter. A temporary holding agreement had been extended, contingent on terms that could be reviewed, adjusted, or withdrawn under specific conditions, and those conditions were not as secure as they appeared. "They are exposed," I said quietly, and he gave a small nod. "More than they realize," he replied. And I let that settle, because exposure is not the same as vulnerability unless someone knows where to apply pressure. I moved my hand across the table, aligning the pages instinctively, and asked, "How many people are aware of this?" Robert shook his head slightly. "Very few," he said, "and none of them would expect you to be one of them." I almost smiled at that, not out of pride, but because it confirmed what I had already understood. Invisibility, when chosen, is one of the strongest positions a person can have. I closed the folder gently and looked at him. "Then we will keep it that way," I said, and he nodded, already anticipating my next words. "I want to attend that dinner," I added, and this time he paused, just briefly, as if weighing the implications. "Are you certain?" he asked, and I met his eyes, calm, controlled. "Yes," I said, "but not for the reason they think, because I was not going to that table to be included, or to repair anything that had already shown its shape. I was going to observe, to confirm what I had seen on paper in the way people carry themselves when they believe they are secure." When I left his office, I did not feel urgency, I felt alignment, every piece beginning to settle into its place. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening, and I prepared for it the same way I prepare for anything that matters, quietly, without announcement. I chose a simple dress, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would invite comment, because attention was not what I needed, clarity was. When Saturday arrived, I drove to there. House just before sunset, the sky low and warm, the kind of evening that makes everything look settled, as if nothing beneath it could be shifting. I parked at the end of the driveway, not in the front, not because I had to, but because I prefer to choose my position, and when I stepped out of the car, I paused for a moment, looking at the house, at the lights already on inside, at the movement behind the windows, and I thought about everything that had led to this point, not the insult, not the laughter, but the years, the decisions, the quiet work that had brought me here. I walked to the door and rang the bell, and when it opened, it was him. The same composed expression, the same measured confidence. "Laura," he said, as if nothing had ever happened, as if that night had been nothing more than a passing moment, and I met his gaze, steady, unshaken, and replied, "Good evening," because I had not come to correct him, not yet. I had come to see how far he believed his ground would hold. I stepped inside and the warmth of the house met me immediately, soft lighting, polished wood floors, the faint scent of something carefully prepared, everything arranged to create the impression of comfort, of stability, of a life that had always been this way. My daughter appeared from the dining room, her smile quick, almost relieved. "Mom, you made it," she said, and I nodded once, offering a small smile in return. "I said I would think about it," I replied, and she stepped aside to let me in further. The room was already set, long table, white plates, glasses aligned perfectly, and his wife stood near the kitchen entrance, greeting me with the same practiced politeness I had seen before. "We are so glad you could join us," she said, her tone even, measured, and I answered, "Thank you for having me," because politeness costs nothing and reveals everything. He moved through the room with the same confidence he had carried at the reception, introducing topics, guiding conversation. His voice steady, controlled, and I watched him carefully, not what he said, but how he said it, the small pauses, the way he emphasized certain points, especially when he spoke about his work, about expansion, about recent acquisitions, each word placed deliberately, as if reinforcing something he needed others to believe. "We have positioned ourselves well," he said at one point, leaning slightly back in his chair, his hand resting casually on the table. "The market is moving in our favor." I took a small sip of water and said nothing, letting the silence follow his statement, because silence often invites more, and he continued, filling that space. "It is about knowing where to invest and when," he added, glancing briefly in my direction, not directly, but enough to acknowledge my presence, as if including me without actually doing so. My daughter watched him as he spoke, her posture aligned with his, attentive, supportive, and I could see how easily she had adjusted herself to fit into that rhythm, that structure. "It must require a great deal of coordination," I said finally, my voice calm, neutral, and he nodded, pleased perhaps that I had engaged. "It does," he replied, "but we have built a network that allows us to move quickly." I let that word settle, quickly, and I placed my glass back down with care. "And securely," I added, just enough to shift the tone, just enough to introduce a question without asking one. There was a slight pause, almost imperceptible, before he answered. "Of course," he said, his smile returning, but I saw it, the smallest hesitation, the kind that only appears when something has been touched that was not expected. The conversation moved on after that, lighter topics, small details, but I remained present, listening, observing, because what matters is not what people say when they are careful, it is what slips through when they believe they are in control. And there were moments, small ones, when his language changed, when certainty softened into approximation, when statements became less precise, and I noted each one, quietly, without reaction. Dinner was served, plates placed in front of us, the rhythm of utensils and conversation filling the room, and at one point, he turned to me again, his tone almost casual. I hope the other evening did not leave a poor impression, he said, as if addressing something minor. Something easily dismissed, and I looked at him, directly this time, my expression unchanged. It was very clear, I said, and for a second, just a second, the room shifted, not visibly, but enough to be felt. My daughter glanced between us, her hand tightening slightly around her glass, and his wife looked down at her plate, adjusting something that did not need adjusting. He held my gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if accepting the statement without challenging it. Good, he said, and returned to his meal. Because people like him rarely confront what they do not fully understand, they move past it, assuming it will resolve itself. I continued through the evening the same way, steady, composed, offering nothing more than what was necessary, because I was not there to argue, not there to correct, I was there to confirm, and by the time dessert was served, I had everything I needed, not just from the documents, but from them, from their behavior, their assumptions, their certainty, and as I set my fork down and folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, I realized something with absolute clarity. They were not prepared for anything outside the version of the world they had constructed, and that meant when it shifted, even slightly, they would not see it coming. I stood up when the evening ended, thanked them for the meal, and walked toward the door, my daughter following me, her voice low. Mom, did everything go okay? She asked, searching my face for something she could understand, and I placed my hand lightly on hers, just for a moment, and said, everything went exactly as it needed to, because it had. And as I stepped out into the night air again, I knew the next step would not require explanation, only timing. I did not act the next day, or the day after that, because the final step is never about speed, it is about precision, and by the time Robert called me again at the end of the week, everything had already been confirmed, every document reviewed, every dependency mapped, every assumption they had built their confidence on laid out clearly in front of me. It is all there, he said, his voice steady, every agreement, every clause, and the one point that matters most. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to let the weight of it settle fully, then prepare it, I replied, but do not send anything yet. There was a short pause before he answered, understood, because he knew what I meant. This was not about catching them off guard, it was about choosing the moment when the truth would carry the most weight. 2 days later, that moment arrived on its own, not because I forced it, but because people who believe they are secure often create their own stage. My daughter called me that morning, her voice strained in a way I had not heard before. Mom, she said quickly, something is wrong. I did not interrupt her, I simply listened. There is an issue with one of their properties, she continued, her words coming faster now. The deal is not holding the way they expected, and they are trying to understand why. I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same street I had lived on for years, unchanged, steady, and I said calmly, and what does that have to do with me? There was a silence on the other end. Just long enough to say everything. He mentioned your name, she said finally, and I let out a slow breath, not surprised, not shaken, just acknowledging what had always been inevitable. Of course he did, I replied, because when structures begin to shift, people look for anything they did not account for, and I had been the one thing they never considered. They want to meet, she added, her voice softer now, uncertain. Today, I turned away from the window and walked to the table, placing my hand lightly on the surface, grounding myself in something familiar. I will come, I said, and when I arrived at their office that afternoon, the atmosphere was different from before, no longer composed, no longer certain. There was a tension in the air that had not been there at the dinner table, assistants moving quickly, voices lower, controlled but strained, and when I was shown into the conference room, he was already there, standing at the far end of the table, The same man who had raised his glass days earlier, but something in his posture had shifted, not visibly to most, but enough for me to see it. "Laura," he said, his tone measured, but lacking the ease it once carried, and I nodded once, taking a seat without waiting to be invited, because position matters. "You wanted to see me?" I said, not as a question, but as a statement. He glanced briefly at the papers in front of him, then back at me. "There appears to be a complication," he began, choosing his words carefully, and I allowed a small silence before answering. "There is no complication," I said calmly. "There is only a misunderstanding of what you thought you controlled." The room went still, not dramatically, but enough that every sound seemed to pull back. My daughter sat to the side, her hands folded tightly, her eyes moving between us, trying to follow something she had never been shown before. "That property," I continued, my voice even, steady, "the one you referenced so confidently, it is not what you believe it is." He straightened slightly, his expression tightening. "And what exactly do you believe it is?" he asked. And I met his gaze without hesitation. "It is part of a structure that you have been using without fully understanding its foundation," I said, and then I placed the document on the table, sliding it toward him, not forcefully, just enough for it to reach his hands. "And that foundation," I added, "is mine." He did not speak immediately, his eyes moving across the page, reading, then reading again, the confidence that had filled his voice days before now replaced by something quieter, something more careful. And I did not rush him, I did not explain further, because the truth, when it is clear, does not need to be repeated. After a moment, he looked up, and for the first time since I had met him, he did not have a prepared response. My daughter's voice came softly from the side, "Mom," but she did not finish the sentence, because there was nothing left to say. I stood then, smoothing my jacket, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with completion. "You spoke about knowing your place," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "The truth is, you never knew mine." I let that settle, not as a threat, not as a victory, but as a fact, and I turned toward the door, pausing only long enough to add, "Respect is not something you demand in a room, it is something you recognize before you lose it." And then I left, not looking back, because I did not need to see what happened next. I already knew, some lessons do not arrive loudly, they arrive quietly, and once they do not leave.